I'm going to present on Mary Calkins. Before we can present, let's look at an overview of what this presentation will be about. This presentation will begin with a background on Mary Calkins. We will then look at her work and contributions, and finally we will look at her impact on the psychological world today. So who was Mary Calkins? Mary was born in 1863 to Charlotte and Walcott Calkins in Connecticut. She was one of 5 siblings, and this family was a very tight-knit family. Family was everything. They did everything together. Along with that, her father very much pushed the educational opportunities for his children. They learned to speak German and French at a very young age, and they all were accepted into colleges early and even graduated ahead of their scheduled terms. In 1883, one of Mary's sisters unexpectedly died, and this was considered a detrimental point in the family dynamics as it broke apart some of that tight-knit family relationships that had been there previously. A couple years later, the family decided that they were going to take a trip to Europe. And this was just supposed to be kind of a family getaway, pursue some educational opportunities, just travel, see what was out there. While they were on this trip, Mary ran into an instructor from Vassar College, and this professor asked if Mary would like to go on some research with him, or go on a research trip with him. And she was like, yeah, sure. So they headed to Greece, where Mary took up some Greek studies. When she returned to Massachusetts, her father had arranged for an interview as a teacher at Wellesley College. She was offered this position, and she spent the next few years teaching Greek to other women. While she was teaching, she was given a book by a colleague that spiked her interest in philosophy and psychology. Professor Wundt at the Wellesley College, as well as some other colleagues, had just finished setting up some laboratorial programs, and they wanted to expand what they offered at the university. And one of the things they wanted to do was have Mary take a role in teaching these new classes. However, to accept this teaching position, Mary had to obtain some more schooling. Specifically, she had to have at least 1 year of psychological education. For women, this was quite difficult due to psychology being a very male-dominated field, um, and she applied to many universities, but nobody would allow her to attend. In 1890, Mary asked for permission from Harvard to sit in on some courses in philosophy taught by William James and Joyce Rice. These professors were willing to let her sit in, but the professor of Harvard, or the president of Harvard, said that this was not going to happen due to the fact that she was a woman. Later that year, with some help from her father, though, the president agreed to let her sit in on classes, not as a student, but as a guest. While she was sitting in on these classes, she was able to do some research at Clark University, and she was also able to attend the first American Psychological Association meeting in 1892. After she had finished this course of studies, she continued to teach at Wellesley, and she also wanted to continue her education. To do this, she sought permission to work under a Professor Munsterberg in a lab at Harvard. This was granted again as a guest, not as a student. After a few years, though, once Mary had met all the requirements for her PhD, if she were a student, Munsterberg requested that she be allowed this PhD degree, but Harvard president denied this because she was a woman. Despite this, Mary presented her thesis in 1895 entitled An Experimental Research on the Association of Ideas. So let's look at Mary's work. First of all, it's important to note that Mary was the first woman president of the American Psychological Association in 1905, and she was elected president of the American Physiological Association in 1918. This was a crucial point because, as I stated before, psychology up until now was considered a very male-dominated field. But with her research, Mary was, determined to gain an education and work under these other professors to perform research and develop um, different methods and ideas. And she was given an opportunity to present a woman's voice in the field of psychology. Um, this was also important because at the turn of the 20th century, 1 in 5 women was employed, and this kind of created like a new woman, new man vibe for the communities, and the men saw the woman as a threat. In addition to being a voice, it's also important to note how Mary overcame many different marginalization challenges she faced while trying to pursue her education and while trying to pursue a career as well. One of the biggest things that Mary accomplished while being a student was her paired association method. The goal of this research was to see how factors influenced associative conditions like memory. Through her research, she had a total of 60-ish participants who participated in over 2,000 trials and study tests. During these tests, they were presented lists of paired associate items with some cue items and response items, and the items were correspondent to several different consciousness characteristics that were manipulated. Throughout this research, it was found that frequency was the strongest influencer in the task of remembering the items. This showed that it didn't matter what order the items were presented in or for how long the items were presented, but how many times an item was presented. The more it was presented, the more likely it was to be remembered. Despite the significance of these results, however, her findings were ignored for 50 plus years before they became actually considered an important milestone in psychology. Mary also developed a better understanding of self-psychology, which was very unpopular at the time due to the fact that psychology was seen as not a science but as a lens of like ideas and behaviors. But this time marked a switch to include more scientific methods in psychological research, which therefore allowed her to study things such as soul and consciousness. Mary found that um, she that the soul was seen as indefinable but not indescribable. This meaning that while we can't necessarily put words on things and that it's like hard to understand, we can still describe like the pieces of what we do know. Interestingly enough, Mary also found that as a whole, people are so focused on themselves um, and how they play a role in the world and what they want that we don't necessarily see ourselves in the influences and expressions that we give off. Mary's impact today. So the paired associates method is still used. Um, One example of this still being used is in a study by Morgs et al. And in 2016, and they used the paired associates method to look at how individuals learn to read. So the paired association method is used by combining a combination of visual and verbal stimuli. And the idea here is that if you compare a word with a physical object or another word, a child can learn that word easier, thus increasing the level of reading knowledge at a faster rate. So if you can have a picture of a hat and show a child a picture of the word hat, they can easier put it together than if you just have the word hat and they don't know what a hat is. Further, Mary's role as a woman in a male-dominated field is very crucial and important to note, as we have talked about already in this presentation. She created a pathway and allowed for a feminine voice to step through the male-dominated fields that were considered, what a man says is tried and true, and it just created a new foundation for ideas and interpretations of work. Also, Mary opened one of the first psychological labs in 1891. And Mary was the first APA female president, which is a huge accomplishment. And here are my references.